reading is much more active generally than watching a movie. Like, the images sort of wash over you. Um, but Chainsaw does something where it sort of activates your brain almost like a reader. Like it makes you see things that or imagine things that aren't actually on the screen.
Want to listen to this episode ad-free? Head on over to our Patreon, patreon.com/Ivory Tower Boiler Room. And for an exclusive offer, I am offering you all a free trial to our ITBR professor level, which gives you all of our episodes, all of them unedited, and you can see all of the video footage. And do you know about the ITBR book club? On November 24th, we are actually meeting for the first time in person in Manhattan. We are going to meet at 3:30 p.m. at the Morgan Library and Museum, and we are going to talk about The Personal Librarian. If you are also a Wicked fan, at 12:30 p.m. on the same day, the 24th, a group of us are going to see Wicked at the AMC on 42nd Street in Times Square. So if you want to come and join us, that's where we'll be. Okay, hope I see some of you at the in-person book club at the Morgan Library at 3:30 p.m. Sunday, November 24th. And now, enjoy this episode. Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Andrew Rimby, and welcome back to the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. This is a very special Halloween episode. So I think that it's time to talk about all things horror. I mean, horror is an any season topic, but that's my opinion, but especially for Halloween. So I'm joined with award-winning author Paul Tremblay, who won the Bram Stoker British Fantasy Massachusetts Book Awards. He's the nationally best-selling author of The Beast You Are, The Pallbearers Club, Survivor Song, Growing Things and Other Stories, The Cabin at the End of the World that, we'll talk a lot about because M. Night Shyamalan adapted it into A Knock at the Cabin. Um, just a knock at the cabin, right? Not a knock at the cabin door.
Yeah, no, that would be more grammatically correct.
Okay. I always want to say a knock at the cabin door. Okay. Well, that is Paul's voice,
Yeah.
everyone.
Hey,
Disappearance
everybody.
at Devil's Rock, A Head Full of Ghosts, and the crime novels The Little Sleep and Sleep Till Wonderland. He lives outside of Boston, which is so appropriate for spooky season with the fall foliage. And I'm here, well, not only to talk about A Cabin at the End of the World, but horror movie, which my book club is reading. It
Oh, great.
has been, yes, so widely acclaimed. And I mean, my first question for you, Paul, is how did you get bit by the horror bug? Like, when did this journey start for you?
Well, first, thanks for having me on, Andrew. I'm excited to chat. Yeah, it's funny. In some ways, it's hard to answer because, like, as long as I remember, like, I've always been sort of scared by and enjoyed horror movies. But I guess we'll blame uh, when I was like 7, 8, 9, pre-cable television. Wow, I'm really aging myself. There was a program that played locally in the Boston area on Saturdays called Creature Double Feature. And so the first movie was always like a Godzilla or Gamera kaiju movie, and the second movie was a more direct horror movie. Um, usually black and white, usually something that was really goofy, but they still gave me nightmares. Like I still remember having a nightmare after watching Attack of the Killer Shrews, which is such a bad movie. That was once shown on Mystery Science Theater 3000 at one point. So yeah, I don't know, just as long as, then after that, once cable TV hits, I just watched a lot of TV. Um,
Hmm.
I was just always like afraid of the dark and slept with stuffed animals around my head and all that fun stuff.
Yeah. Were you specifically interested in, say, psychological horror, slasher films, gore horror? Like, was there
Yeah.
one genre that you've always just been more drawn to?
I guess I was always more drawn to, supernatural, psychological, kind of movies. And I definitely was never a slasher fan. My younger brother, he was 5 years younger than me, but, once he hit like the age 8, he was watching way more gorier stuff than I could handle. Um, so it was just kind of funny. Like, the younger brother was, I think he first saw Texas Chainsaw at like 10. I think I first watched it when I was in my mid to late 30s. Um, Yeah, but I mean that's not to say like obviously like every sort of like you say, oh, this is what I like. There's always ones from other subgenres that are like, oh no, I really like that too. But
Hmm.
yeah, I tend to gravitate towards the stuff that's going to make me question if there's something under my bed or in the closet or in the basement.
Yeah. So like Terrifier 3 is not for you.
No, I haven't seen any of them.
Yeah, I just came
Uh,
off of seeing Smile 2. Did you
okay.
have a chance to see Smile 2?
No, it's just been so busy this fall. Like it's so hard to get out to the theaters.
Yeah. Well, because when you're not writing your like internationally acclaimed horror novels and stories, you're a mathematics instructor, aren't you?
True horror, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so the fall tends to be my busiest time of year because it's a small school and they expect us to pitch in with coaching too. And that's really like the bigger time suck. I mean, I feel
Mm.
like I can handle like the school load, but then like coaching after school just takes like another hour or two and then there's traffic and
Oh my.
um but yeah, I can't complain. The school's been very supportive. So yeah, so it's like in the fall, it's usually me just trying to squeeze in what horror I can.
Yeah. Yeah. So what do you coach? I'm just curious.
Oh, I'm like the third assistant on the freshman football team. You know, just
Oh,
a warm body. I never played in high
okay.
school.
Well,
I had been the long time JV high school basketball coach. Again, I didn't play any of that. I mean, I played like with friends, but never like played on a team in high school. It was just more being there. But I was able to get rid of the basketball because that season's way longer and it's way more of a time commitment. So, like I
mm,
said, the school's been, really supportive and helpful in allowing me to do this, this other career. But
yeah. Has there been
yeah.
any creative ideas that came from, you being at this small school?
Oh, for sure. Like I never really, yeah, that's not true. I guess I wrote a short story called The Teacher once. It's pretty harrowing. But no, just being around like teenagers is, not that I'm an energy vampire, but just to take their energy. And honestly, like listening to them talk is like a great lesson in voice and
Mm.
dialogue, especially as like the slang changes every like 3 to 4 years. It's
Oh,
really kind of fun to see. And sometimes like, there's been a few books where I've directly taken some slang. Like my book, Disappearance at Devil's Rock. I
mm.
was definitely using I remember very school specific slang. I remember seeing a few reviews like, wow, those, eighth grade boys are really annoying. I'm like, yes, eighth grade boys are really annoying. That's what I was kind of, going for. But yeah,
Yeah. Well, my students, I teach English and writing at 3 colleges, and I'm kind of like a traveling
pretty,
college
oh,
instructor.
yeah,
But the Gen Z slang, like sometimes I feel like I really know their dialect, and then all of a sudden
yeah,
they'll drop a phrase, and I'm thinking to myself, I don't know what this even means. Like you need to,
yeah.
they need to instruct me because
Oh, for sure.
the language is always, we're always creating new phrases every
Yeah,
generation.
absolutely.
Um,
Now,
but
my daughter was horrified recently when I used Riz correctly. I
risk.
had asked her that, yeah, did I use it correctly? She's like, yes, and don't do it again. I'm like, okay.
So if we see an upcoming novel and Riz is like the
Yeah, I don't
supernatural
think
demon,
that's a good
I'm
idea.
like, oh, that's where it
Uh,
came from. No, but
yeah.
in I just watched A Knock at the Cabin. I like was waiting to watch it until I interviewed you. And
Uh-huh.
like I know the differences. So I'm gonna say right now, spoiler alert, because this is a big spoiler
Yeah,
alert. But M. Night Shyamalan, I've always just been a huge fan. The Sixth Sense is like my bread and butter when it
sure.
comes to like how psychological horror is told. Um,
Hmm.
so what was that process of just being consulted or like because I know sometimes I've had Gregory Maguire on and he said like when he sold the rights to Wicked, it was just out of his hands. Like he
Yeah.
gets invited back, he got to go to the film set. But did
Right.
you have any play with A Knock at the Cabin? Like were you involved with the screenplay?
So, excuse me. I similarly had no contractual say in anything involving the movie. We first optioned it in early 2018, which is like 6 months before the book was published.
Wow.
Um, so, I mean, it was a very long process. It took a couple of years before there was a screenplay that I read. And, they let me give comments on it. They didn't listen to any of my comments, but but even then, it was like so that was 2019. There was another probably full year before it was like, oh, M. Night's really interested.
Hmm.
Um, and he had a film deal in hand. He was like, oh, he probably wants to make this. He just has to finish making Old first. But then like once Old finished, and then it was, I believe it was the summer of 21, things started really picking up speed where he was writing the screenplay. Then like in late fall, he started announcing like some of the casting. And I did have my first phone call with him was in November of 21. And that was a wild phone call, like you mentioned, Sixth Sense. Like, I watched Sixth Sense in the theater when I was like a hobbyist writer, I would describe myself. So here I am talking to that guy. And I appreciate that he was upfront with what he was going to change in terms of the story and things like that. And then in the spring, like he texted me some questions about, hey, where'd you get the inspiration for the design of the weapons and a few like side questions like that. But I didn't even get to see a screenplay until like May after I had visited the set and they were pretty much done shooting. So yeah, that's a long rambling answer to say, yeah, I had no say in anything.
But I saw that incredible photo of you and like specifically Jonathan Groff, which
Mm,
I'm a huge Broadway fan. So,
yeah.
Merrily We Roll Along, Spring Awakening. Um, seems like such like a kind soul.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
but that whole cast like really worked well together, in my opinion, especially to have a child actress like that. I'm just curious, like, did you know anything about what it was like for them to have a child actress witnessing such gruesome sequences?
Yeah. So I did get to visit the set 2 days. And the cast were amazing. They were all super friendly. That was actually one of my favorite parts. Jonathan was super nice, so was but Ben Aldridge and Nikki Amuka-Bird. Um, I didn't see I didn't get to talk to Dave Bautista as much, but he was very nice. I had the whole cast like sign a copy of my book, which was fun.
Oh,
And I did get to see them again after the premiere. Um, So being there only 2 days, I didn't quite see like, how are they going to hide like some of the stuff from the actor who played Wen. But they did have two because of, child labor laws. If because the actor who played Wen could only be there a certain amount of hours, so they would try to, if it was later, they would try to work around and have like her stand in, be in shots where there wasn't, necessarily you weren't going to get like the full shot of her face. But yeah, I have to admit, I was a little nervous meeting her and her mom at certain points, because they were really excited. And in my head, I'm like, oh, did you read the book? Um, yeah, I remember at the after the premiere, her mom wanted me to take some pictures with Wen. I'm like,
oh.
okay, don't read the book, or maybe I don't know. Yeah,
Yeah, you're like, read it when you're in high school.
yeah, when you're a little bit older, yeah.
Yeah, well, are you currently looking for your next great read and you just don't know where to search? Well, I have a publisher for you. They are called Broadview Press. They're celebrating their 40-year anniversary. Happy anniversary, Broadview. And they are an independent publisher of humanities books. So next month for Native American Heritage Month, I have on Dr. Andrea Sullivan Clark, and she is going to educate us on indigenous philosophies of Turtle Island. You might wonder what Turtle Island is. And if you're listening and are in North America, I'm just going to give you a hint. You probably are in Turtle Island territory. So I can't wait for you all to hear more about Native American history and culture, just subjects that we need to learn about and we just don't in our primary school education. So, Ways of Being in the World is Andrea's book. I can't wait for more of you to get your hands on it. Also, just in time for the Wicked film, Broadview Press has an edition of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz with the original illustrations. I was talking with Dylan from Broadview Press, and I always love talking with her because she informs me of what new books they're about to release. And guess what? Just in time for spooky season in the fall, they have a vampire literature anthology that collects so many different short stories that explore the vampire myth and just how this origin story of the vampire came to be in our culture. So I hope you get your hands on those books. And Dylan told me there is an exclusive code for all ITBR listeners. You get 20% off all of your Broadview Press orders. Broadviewpress.com. Go choose your books, type in Ivory Tower in the discount code section and you will get 20% off. Make sure you follow Broadview Press to see all the new books that they are about to publish on Instagram at Broadview Press. Enjoy your reading, everyone. I mean, the major difference, right, is the ending,
Mhm.
that the husbands are actually the ones to survive. Spoiler. I said spoiler alert already, but
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
that Wen is actually accidentally killed.
In the book,
And
yeah.
like, I'm just wondering, did M. Night Shyamalan make that change because he didn't want to have like the murder of a child, or was there something else to his meaning?
Well, yeah, like I think especially with a big uh studio involved, they felt like, oh, that would be too much. And, they kept saying they also want to have like a quote unquote more helpful ending, hopeful ending,
Mm,
and things like that. And Knight was like, oh, I'm making more of a thriller, not a horror novel, so like we can't have that happen. But they kept talking about a more hopeful ending.
mm,
And since we're talking spoilers, I think his ending is way more disturbing,
mm,
and not hopeful. I find the ending to my book hopeful. That's not to say terrible things don't happen in the book, but the idea that in the movie, that one of the dads and Wen have to not only live with the knowledge that they let, one of their loved ones like kill himself, sacrifice himself, they
mhm.
also have to live with the knowledge that there's just incredibly cool, capricious, supreme being that just, killed thousands of people for what? For some sort of little weird
Yeah.
mind game. I find that way more disturbing than,
Okay.
at least in my book, I viewed it as a hopeful thing. The two dads refused. They thought, they're essentially saying this is an immoral choice.
Mm.
We refuse to participate in this. Um, I don't know. So I
Yeah.
know like not everyone's going to feel that way, but that's how I feel.
Well, I also just feel like the way that you center, like, I know some have called it like such a wonderful depiction of queer trauma, like at the heart of your novel, but
Mm,
like even to have just two men survive at the end of the world, like that there isn't this any like type of reproductive possibility if it's just
mm,
two men, as a gay man, I found it really like your ending is very empowering, but it's also like
yeah,
really going against that generational tradition. Like, was that
right.
something you like have you wrestled with? Is like, oh, okay, this not saying like I've even said to my students when you talk to an author about their book and you ask them interpretive questions, authors don't usually want to like have that interpretive
Yeah,
power over their books, but like, what was that like to just have two men survive?
that's a great question. It's funny. I think because I started writing this book in 2015, and is that true? No, 2016. Sorry. Started it like in earnest, like the summer of 2016, and finished it just about a year later. Uh, and in some ways, I have to admit I was not ignorant, but like I wasn't thinking about like some of the conversations that really came to fore, I would say in 2020. Like I mean, these conversations were being happening, but like, once the pandemic hit and George Floyd, there was a lot more conversations about um, I don't know, civil rights, social rights, etc.
Mm,
I started off the book from a place of, oh, I just written two books that feature a couple of families in distress both by interior and exterior forces, and I didn't want to have the same family. And Cabin was gonna be my seventh book that I wrote, and that felt like a special number to me. So I was like, oh, when I first started writing, besides my wife, my consistent first readers, and they were reading like the terrible early stuff, but always so supportive, was my cousin Michael and his husband Rob, and my
oh,
Aunt Mary and her wife Debbie. I was like, okay, with this book, I kind of want to honor, try to
mm,
honor them, for all the, things that they've done to me and like, their dear friends and loved ones. So that was really sort of the place from where I started. So I don't know if I necessarily was thinking of like the high-minded ending beyond like, no, these two are going to choose, they're going to choose hope over fear. They're going to choose love over fear, which my main worry is like, I didn't want it to be like too saccharine. I didn't want it to be too sappy or sentimental.
yeah,
Um, because obviously they'd been through hell and back and
mm,
and who knows what laid ahead of them.
yeah,
Um, Yeah, so and for that book, I brought back like Michael as my first reader. It's the first time I'd done that in like a long time.
mm,
Um, and it's funny, like his response to the book immediately was like, "Yeah, I don't think there's a an apocalypse happening. And I'm like, oh, okay, good. Like, I not good. He's right. It was like good. I just assumed everybody would assume. It's like, okay, because I kind of wanted people to be
Mhm.
able to think, both ways. And I way underestimated how many readers were going to be bothered by me not telling them if the apocalypse was happening or not.
Ah, okay. Yeah, like that psychological manipulative game that like these four who represent or symbolize possibly the four horsemen
Right.
of the apocalypse. But that was actually something I was going to ask you before we turn to horror movie, Paul, is
Yeah.
like your book to me, and I think it's even shown through the film, which is wonderful. Like I do think that even though like the plot doesn't necessarily follow the order of your plot
Yeah.
or there's significant changes, I think that like it has such an ancient, in my opinion, very like mythical um Greek feel to it. Like
Mm.
in my reading, your work like has such a feel to Stephen King's Carrie or The
Oh,
Shining.
thank
Like
you.
it really has that like tapping into the underbelly of the beast, like polytheism or like what's the
Hmm.
unexplainable. Like to the ancient Greeks say, I just taught Antigone like why does she keep trying to want to bury her brother and go against Creon? And then like the gods, they see the omens of the birds and
Right.
like the interpretation that they put into nature. Like I really felt that in your work. Specifically, I mean, in a cabin at the end of the world. Like that
Yeah.
really comes through. Is that something
Well, thank
are
you.
you usually wrestling with those like ancient questions or like turning back to
Yeah.
history?
That's a, I have to, well, one, like I studied math in college, so, I have like a very cursory knowledge of, Greek tragedy, et cetera. Like I took Western Civ for, a couple of years when I was in college. So, I can't say I was expressly thinking about those sort of myths. Um, but what I will say is that I'm fascinated by characters caught in the maelstrom of like this wider world, and like I'm just interested in like what are they going to do? Like what are they going to do now? Like how do we live through this? How does anybody live through this? When you really have no chance to like fix it. This isn't a
Yeah.
big blockbuster. We're like, oh no, we're going to stop the earthquake from happening by doing this, or like some weird pseudoscience thing. And I mean, the things I was wrestling with when I started the book, I feel like for the first time, or I should say one of the few times I started a book with like a political sort of context in mind. Usually that just sort of happens.
Hmm.
But like I mentioned, I started it the summer of 2016. So the book to me was like, oh, I want this book to feel like the anxieties that so many of us are feeling during the reveal of Trumplandia,
Mm,
which we're sort of going through again, unfortunately. Uh,
yeah.
so there was that, but also, I mean, sort of the maybe, is there a supernatural being that's doing this? I mean, that's like a fundamental fear of mine that not only that there is a supreme being, they're incredibly cruel. So I don't know, like those were sort of the two bigger things I was wrestling with, but it's still, I hope the characters, hopefully personal story.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like those anxieties. I mean, that's something with the genre of horror. Like those anxieties, whether it be like current horror, I feel like there's so much with environmental crises and humanitarian issues and war and global conflict and, political strife and
Yeah.
like families attacking one another because of beliefs. Like, do you think that that's why horror is just such a long like is so ancient as a tradition is because it always taps into the fears and anxieties of our everyday life.
Yeah, I definitely think that's a part of it. I mean, fear is a universal thing that, all conscious beings, we
Mhm.
can talk about animals too. Anything with a consciousness, knows what fear is, experiences fear. Um, and as a writer, I don't know, I'm fascinated by it, like what it does to people, how fear, warps your decision making process, and things like that. As well as like the weird, I would say the weird thing of it being, it can be entertaining. I know for some people, if it's a cathartic thing, I don't
Mhm.
feel like it's a catharsis for me. Everyone's going to go to it for different reasons, which is another fun part about horror. For me, it's like even like if I think it works as a story, if I think it works as art, because not every horror story does. I mean, there's a lot I don't like. Um, I find that weirdly hopeful. Like just the idea that, oh, this filmmaker, writer, they see that something is terribly wrong. And I like that. Oh, you feel that way too. I think Kazuo Ishiguro, a Japanese writer, talks about that frequently, that sort of magic connection between writer and reader. And for me, that just makes me feel less overwhelmed and less alone. Like, okay, someone else out there sees, this madness,
Yeah.
and that's a hopeful thing, I think, just that communication.
Yeah.
At the same time, Evil Dead 2 is one of my favorite movies. I don't know how much, I don't know how much of that's going on there, but I mean, there's something just to the energy of that movie. But anyway,
Yeah, well, and something that Greek tragedies, because I have brought in some horror clips. Like I actually just showed the Carrie, one of my favorite horror film scenes is like
yeah,
the prom scene where she
yeah,
like just gets one over on all the bullies and like is in her glory. Like the flames are blazing.
yeah,
And she just opens the doors and she's just walking like a queen. But like there is still some hope in Stephen King of like she is able to like Carrie's able to rise above after all of that horror bullying done to her
yeah,
and her mother's bullying. But Greek tragedies, it follows like that line where there is a little hope that even after all the deaths, a character comes to a realization that they were in the wrong. Like that catharsis can actually happen with the audience because they can sympathize with even the person who is seen as a villain. Where like, in your novels, what I love so much is you leave us in, I know NPR, New York Times, like they've talked a lot about the ambiguity that you leave in your
Mhm.
novels. Like, and is that unsettling nature? It seems like it's something that you love to psychologically delve into is not leaving your reader with all the answers. You
Yeah.
like to have the gray exist at the end of this story.
Yeah, thank you again. But I mean, in that scene from Carrie, I mean, even starting from when they first show up, like the scene where she's dancing
Mm,
with the guy that just spinning, and it's wonderful filmmaking. Yeah, but anyway, like so, not everything I do has ambiguity in it. I mean, but a lot does clearly, and I take that seriously. Like I know it's an ask for the reader, so I hope it never feels like a cheap sort of like twist ending. Like for me, if I'm going to use ambiguity, it has to be part and parcel of the theme. It has to be, in my mind, the only way that story can be told. Um, I know it's clearly something I'm obsessed with. Like, I think, you as a writing teacher, like write what you know, I
mhm,
think is terrible advice, but write your obsessions is great advice because they're going to be there anyway. Um, I don't know, like I usually I default, if there is a default, into trying to make my stories, I want them to feel like this could be happening.
mhm,
With a head full of ghosts, I'm like, oh, maybe possession. I think a reality TV crew would show up. I wanted to try to make it feel as real as possible. And the same thing with Cabin. Um, and so I don't know. I just think like whether or not something supernatural is happening, when I try to make that feel realistic, I
mhm.
think, so I've never seen a ghost, not that I believe in them, but I don't want to be proven wrong either. I feel like if I experience something quote unquote supernatural, I think it would be really subtle and it would be hard to identify. And I would probably within the hour or the day be able to somewhat explain it away. But then that lingering
Mm.
doubt would hang over. I don't know. And to me, I feel like that's a wonderful effect of a horror story that I try to go after a lot.
Yeah. Well, even when Knock at the Cabin, like the film begins and you see when talking to the mysterious man,
Yeah,
um I was like it could turn into the strangers. Like there is a
right.
time where like being in the cabin, being in an isolated place, like you psychologically set us up as a reader thinking, oh, they're going to murder them right away.
Right.
Like to me, those films like The Strangers, I just get so uncomfortable as an audience member watching
Yeah,
a film like that because I know what's going to happen. I'm like, they're not
right.
going to survive. Like, this is not nothing good is coming from this.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, with horror movie, like my first question is like that meta nature, like you really tap into what I love so much is this is the time for your book, Paul. Like, and I mean that in all seriousness because
Yeah.
I feel like horror as a genre in literature has had a lot of like contested identity issues, like thinking about well, what does that mean when it comes to like us versus the outside world or us and our internal
Right.
struggles? Um, and maybe that's because of like global politics. I don't know. But I think that
Yeah.
there's so much fear right now out there that like to want to like delve deeper into fear in your own personal like viewing or reading life is more just triggering to some
Yeah.
people. But like what you do is so, I mean, innovative is like actually writing a book that also becomes a screenplay, like where they're actually trying to put together a horror movie and then it gets lost. And then Hollywood decides,
Yeah.
okay, I guess we'll reboot whatever this lost footage is, which wasn't even a movie, but I guess we'll call it a reboot of a cult, like putting together a cult, the cult following exists. So like there is an appetite for it.
Yeah.
You know, where did that idea come from of, okay, I want this like film within a film type narrative?
Um, so some of it came from just like a little bit of a logic experiment. Like early on, I fell into like a Texas Chainsaw rabbit hole, which I briefly mentioned earlier that I
Mhm.
avoided watching because of its reputation. I mean, the title of the movie alone, right?
Yeah.
And I just remember back like when I was growing up, like, oh, that must be like one of the goriest movies. And like there's these weird cultural memories that are false. What's that called? I forget what's that called. The Mandelbrot effect or something like that?
Oh,
No,
like where
Mandela
the
effect, right?
Berenstein, like people thought
Yeah, yeah,
like
yeah,
the
yeah.
Berenstein Bears or
Right.
the,
Yeah.
I forgot the actual, um,
Yeah.
yeah, the example they use, but it's like the Berenstein
Yeah,
Bears.
yeah. Right. But with that movie, I mean, there are people like who had these memories of seeing Leatherface like disembowel a character actually cutting with the chainsaw.
Oh.
And that doesn't happen in the movie. It's not quite bloodless, but it's almost bloodless. Like you certainly don't see any penetration of a chainsaw into somebody or hacking off a limb. And if it came out today, it would probably be like a low R, maybe borderline PG-13 if the original came out. Um, so I was fascinated sort of by the effect that the movie had, because to me that seemed like the movie replicated a little bit some of the affect of reading. Like, reading is much more active generally than watching a movie. Like, the images sort of wash over you. Um, but Chainsaw does something where it sort of activates your brain almost like a reader. Like it makes you see things that or imagine things that aren't actually on the screen.
Hmm.
Um, so I was fascinated by that part of it, and like I wanted to compare like in this book, like what are the differences, the pluses, minuses, well, maybe not pluses and minuses, but the different effects of and affects of reading versus watching a horror movie.
Have you ever asked yourself, how does Andrew know about all of these LGBTQ plus books, films, TV shows, even theater happening in New York City? Well, I'll give you all a look into my interview process. The Gay and Lesbian Review is my definitive magazine that I turn to. I have a digital subscription and I learned so much about the current LGBTQ literature and TV and films that exist in the universe of all things queer art and culture. So Stephen Hemrick, the publisher, has promised me, and I know he keeps his promise, that the November-December holiday issue is going to be just such an incredible array of diverse voices in the LGBTQ community. So right now, though, you can read the September and October issue. It's called The Scientists, and it's all about investigating, interrogating queer science. Vernon Rosario, who's been on the podcast, has an article called The Origins of Transgender Science. Andrew Holleran, who wrote the definitive gay iconic book, Dancer from the Dance, has an article about Lord Byron and sexual mutations. William Beneman has an article about Pervert Patient Zero. I need to read that right away. That's an incredible, enticing title. And soon I will have an episode coming out on election day. Yes, I'm releasing an episode on election day all about LGBTQ politics and just what does my co-host think about the current state of gay politics. So thank you to Stephen. The GNLR has an exclusive ITBR code. It is ITBR 50. You receive 50% off. 50% off your print or digital subscription. So head to glreview.org, click subscribe, enter promo code ITBR50, and you will get 50% off. Also, make sure you follow the Gay and Lesbian Review on Instagram. It's at the GL Review, and you will see updates and teasers to upcoming articles, essays, and conversations that will be on their website and in the magazine. I hope you all enjoy your reading.
Um, and I was just interested in the idea of art in general, sort of the price of art, especially from the collaborative side of things, which I have very little experience with. Um, that movie was a famously rough, dangerous set. Um, and everyone involved, like, were taking huge risks, both financially, because it was a zero budget. I'm sure mental health wise, which they weren't thinking about in the 70s, probably as much. Shooting for like 20 hours, and actually, and physically dangerous because they were using real chainsaws. And, some of the shots that they set up, so lucky that they didn't end up actually cutting somebody. But, this movie is a piece of art. So to me, I think it's worth it. I hope I wouldn't say that if someone died on set. But I think that's a really interesting, I thought it was a very interesting question
Mm.
about art and horror art in particular. Like, where's the line? What's worth it? I mean, especially for something that depends on transgression, right? Horror has to have some sort of transgression in it. It has to make you uncomfortable in some way.
Mhm.
I don't know. So I was thinking about a lot of that, bigger picture wise. But sorry, this is a rambling answer. But the the thing with the screenplay for me, it was a little bit of logic. It's like, okay, I knew it. I had this older film in '93, got made pretty much, but never made it to screen. And then we're going to follow this character as he bounces back and forth between the past and present as being rebooted. And I knew I needed the reader to know the story of the movie or
Mhm.
what the movie was. I just thought it would be really boring to have characters sitting around talking about what happened in the movie. I was like, oh, no, I'll include the screenplay. That way they get to see the whole what was supposed to be the whole original movie. And that was really sort of the starting point for the inclusion of the screenplay.
Yeah. Well, and that, I mean, so many are using the term cursed film genre, like to talk about this lost screenplay or like the
Yeah,
mysterious deaths, right? Like at the beginning, it's not a spoiler. Like we know that there's been, you know,
something happened. Yeah,
unknowable, yeah. Just horror, like deaths, accidents, very like Phantom of the Opera, like something's been haunting this cast of the film. And there's only one survivor left who actually can join the reboot cast 30 years later. I'm curious, was that something like you did not reveal all of your cards, like as the creator of
right.
this novel? Is that exciting for you, like for the reader to try to like just be in anticipation of that climax? Like, okay, well, what happened, you know, to those who are writing the screenplay? Like, how do they meet their end? Like, how do you build that
Right.
suspense throughout your novel?
Yeah, so part of it to me, that was like the big question that I know I wanted hanging over the reader. I mean, you were talking about the strangers before. I think, the fact that something terrible is going to happen. Um, that's a great source of suspense for the reader. And the same thing in horror movie, I was kind of hoping that it would continue to pull the reader forward because they want to find out what happens to, character X, who
Mhm.
I reveal pretty early isn't alive anymore. Um, but what they don't know is how it happened. And at the same time, I was hopeful that it was other threads from like 15 years after the movie and from right now that hopefully all sort of build towards, build toward a climax by the end. And
Yeah.
hopefully I think that worked for some people. It worked for me.
No, it definitely works. No, it works,
Yeah.
in my opinion. Um, but like also the whole like premise of the Thin Man. I mean, I first learned about your book from I mean, I'd been like always on the lookout to see like what new horror novels are being published. So like it like came up right away that it was coming out in the summer. Oh, that's another question I had for you, Paul. Like the release of your book, um like I was thinking, oh, it'll come out during the Halloween season, but like was there a reason why it came out like in the summer season?
Yeah, well, for one, because I still teach, like if it
Mm,
came out in October, I wouldn't be able to do like promotional stuff. So I've been fortunate that my publisher has worked with me to have all my books come out in the summer. And also, I wouldn't want a horror book coming out in October. It's like I'm giving up like a free a free rediscovery of your book. Like the movie, the book comes out earlier in the year and then
mhm.
people start talking about it again in like September, October. So,
That's true.
but it's mostly the, having a book come out when I'm off for the summer is just better for me.
No, okay, yeah. So logistical reasons, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, I also just think it's amazing that you're balancing um like you and so many other writers. Like I had Mary McMinn on, who is a creative writing professor and um just wrote the book A Rose by Any Other Name, which is like a retelling of who the Dark Lady is in Shakespeare's sonnets. Um so, like, I just to see the reality of, okay, our favorite writers, they're also teachers, or they're like,
Yeah.
they're working it everywhere they can, because yeah, the writing industry, it's money can be difficult. I know
Yeah.
the reality, but like something that I'm just curious with the Thin Man is like creating this device or characterization, like the horror that the actor even faces that we learn, and I'm not going to reveal too much,
Sure.
but the horror that he faces from the cast, and it's not even like fictional physical acts that's done to him. It's like almost method acting gone wrong,
Right.
like method acting that's full of almost torture porn. Like what was where did that come from of you knowing that like that device you were going to use, like him being cast in this role, and then us as readers not knowing the actual horror done to his body?
Yeah. Um, hmm. So I mean, some of it came from, so early on I kind of had to figure out what was the movie inside the book.
Mm,
Um, and I came up with just like a general concept that I don't quite want to say because it's a little bit of a spoiler. And so I just kind of followed that, like what that necessitated the fictional characters in the screenplay doing awful things to this kid,
mm,
to this character. Um, and I knew it was going to be from his point of view mainly, although the screenplay is from Chloe's point of view. Cleo, sorry. Um, from Cleo's point of view. So uh, there is another point of view. But anyway, so I also just thought it'd be fascinating to have like, the thin kid when he's actually acting in this movie in 1993, he's barely out of college. He's a very sort of like vulnerable, not confident kid. But, 30 years later, his 50-year-old self is much more confident, almost to the point of being smug and cynical.
mm,
And so what happened? What happened to sort of do that to him? Or, what sort of changes did he, go through? Which I kind of hope would mirror sort of like the story itself. Whereas, the thin kid character goes through a type of transformation as well.
mm,
Um, I don't know. It was a lot of it is, so I didn't actually. This is one of the books that I didn't write. I didn't sit down and write a plot summary for first, which I've done for a lot of my books. I kind of, I don't want to say I winged it the whole time because I definitely kept notes and would peek ahead. But no, I mean, I'm sure you talk about as a writing teacher, there's just a lot of it is just learning to trust your subconscious and then figuring out what that means or if it has to stay after the fact. And
yeah.
ultimately, I wanted the movie and the book to be like my favorite kind of horror movie, just sort of like inexplicable, maybe even pretentious, indie, disturbing horror movie.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I know that so I'm close to Eric Gary Anderson and Jeffrey Weinstock, the like Gothic professors. So like,
Oh, nice.
I was
Yeah.
part of their book club in the summer when we read for the Society for the Study of the American Gothic, your novel. And it was interesting to hear from like the academic community. They were like just very invested in like the whole just providing like a theoretical language for,
Mm,
okay, like what's up with the Thin Man, like who um what's so horrifying about this character, like how did you create a horror villain? So it was like interesting to see how they were like trying to concoct like what was really evil
Hmm.
about like the fictive element of the horror movie itself that you create. Um so like I mean something that I was just invested in is I'm a huge like just meta, like I love Scream. I love that it
Yeah.
like Wes Craven is was always so into um his characters being in the know and Scream about other horror
Right.
films. And like I was curious, Scream 3 is that like meta Scream film where it's like the Hollywood industry is like, doing all the stab films, and
Right.
like you as an audience member are not only watching Nev Campbell like face out the horror of Ghostface following her, it's like you also are following those who are pretending to reenact the original Scream.
Right.
Um, so like what was that Hollywood element for you? Like did you find it was interesting to kind of see what Hollywood does with stories, and sometimes
Yeah.
like how they sensationalize certain aspects, like whether it be the like sexual elements or whether it be like the stereotypical phone call that happens, like all of those tropes that Hollywood just
Right.
loves to do with horror novels or turning horror
Yeah.
novels into films.
Right. Yeah, I mean, so as you pointed out, I mean, there's a long tradition of meta horror films and meta novels, and even like within the past like 3 years, there's been a whole bunch of like quote unquote cursed film horror novels, which is kind of fun. Just that zeitgeisty thing is happening. Um, and for me, I think part of my interest in it was just I've been in a position where I have had some Hollywood experience. Um, besides Knock at the Cabin, I've had many things optioned and not come through, and I've had all sorts of conversations, with producers. So a lot of that stuff that happens in the book, the book opens with the thin kid talking to a pretty, schmarmy producer. Uh, yeah, and that was sort of right out of my life. So I mean, some of that was like I did want to like hopefully have a little bit of fun and satirize sort of the Hollywood thing, and represent some of my frustrations as someone who loves a good horror story, who loves it when it achieves art.
Mm,
For me, more times than not, especially in this century, it's not being produced like by large studios, unless you're Jordan Peele or something like that. It's being produced by, independent places and sort of newer filmmakers that really have to sort of like fight and scrap for their vision
mm,
to make it through without having like the rough edges sanded off or cut off. So that was definitely like sort of a big part of it.
mm.
Um, And also to people listening out there, to be a little bit fair, there's a character who's a horror writer that I definitely sort of satirize too. I figured it would be only fair if I'm making fun of like Hollywood producers type. I make fun of this horror writer at a horror convention too a
Mhm.
little bit. So I don't know, like it's weird. Like in some cases, like yeah, like ghosts and monsters are somewhat absurd, but if you're willing to engage with it, they're not absurd. It's you can do so much with them in terms of story.
Yeah. Well, and not that you have to like, make some uh scandalous like reveal about your feelings on the Hollywood industry right
Yeah,
now,
yeah,
but like I am just curious, like you hear all the time there's just incredible novels. It's not just horror novels, but like
yeah,
incredible novels that are going to be adapted into a film. And people will say a lot about Stephen King's newer adaptations. Like a lot of, I think, there was like a new Firestarter, or
yeah,
like a lot of like the newer ones they try to adapt. I mean, I think it was pretty successful, but that's my
yeah.
own feeling. Like, do you think it's like conversations you've had with producers? Is it just that like what you see as like a nuanced narrative isn't seen as marketable? Like a lot of it comes down
Right,
to, oh, okay, well, we have to package it in this way. And if we don't like, you know, have characters that speak to the audience that they see as likable or believable, then like it's just not going to work for a mainstream audience. Like, is
right.
that where sometimes a narrative just gets so diluted?
Absolutely. I mean, because it is ultimately all about money. And frankly, in some ways, I get it. Like even with Knock at the Cabin, their budget was 25 million,
Wow.
and when I visited the set, I was like, holy shit! this is 25 million, just like this army of people working and like, they built a cabin inside of a warehouse and all this stuff. So I get that that's like a huge investment, but um, in terms of the story, it's frankly kind of maddening. Now, listen, I've talked to and worked with many producers who are awesome, awesome people. Yeah. But like, 7 out of every 8 are like humans that you can talk to, but like 1 out of 8, maybe 1 out of 7 are like the producer I described in the opening page of the book, or like, you're having a Zoom meeting with them and you can see that they're answering email as they're supposedly listening to you and talking to you.
Oh no.
It's just bizarre. And like just the idea of like the ghosting is like part of the thing. Like you'll talk to a producer and they'll sound like your best friend, then you'll never hear them again. It's just so strange.
Yeah.
I don't understand. What I also don't understand, frankly, is, and this is a little bit self-serving, but like, hey, how about leave the story elements to the people who know story, like the writers and the film director. I mean, it just seems absolutely nuts to me that all these producers, come in with notes or have a say, and like, what do you know about story? Like, and so often I've heard like just terrible suggestions and terrible ideas,
Mm.
come from producers. So I don't know.
Mm.
Again, this is coming from novel land, where I have one editor that I have to satisfy. I don't have to listen to a room of 20 other people coming in with like their two-bit sort of suggestions. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and someone who actually grew up in Salem is Mike Flanagan. Um, and Massachusetts has produced a lot of, New England has produced a
Yeah,
lot of
yeah. New England for
horror
sure. Yeah.
writers and film directors. But like I'm curious, like say Mike Flanagan, the way his like universe has now just like evolved. Like there's always, whether it be Fall of the House of Usher or like he's
Mhm.
always just coming out adapting gothic literature and horror literature. Um, like how do you think that like the engine that he's built, like how does that, even, for those listening who are aspiring horror writers, like, Paul, how did it happen just even for you for it to start to domino where, now you have an editor who is
Yeah.
like asking, okay, well, what's your next subject? Like, what
Yeah.
are you now interested in?
Well, yeah, I mean, for me, it was definitely like a long, winding road. Um, I started messing around with writing in the late 90s, almost inexplicably, because, I just gotten my master's degree in math, never studied writing. But for me, what started it was sort of a later in life than maybe most discovery. It's like, oh, it's okay to actually like things,
Hmm.
which, for younger people, there's so much of like, the pose of, you don't want to be, it's usually not cool to be like, oh, I like this, etc., which is still sort of like the life of the internet as well. Everybody hates everything. But no, for me, that was like a big deal discovering that, oh, like it's okay to be passionate about the things I like. And that included like punk music and these stories I just started falling in love with. And I tried to become a punk musician, and I was messing around with writing, and I figured I was a better writer than musician, unfortunately. Um, but once I started taking writing more seriously, it was, short stories that I was submitting to markets. Um, from 2004 to 2006, I wrote this novel that wasn't horror, but I was trying to find an agent with it, and it took me 2 years to find an agent, hundreds of rejects, but I
Hmm.
just stayed patient. It's a different publishing landscape now, and I'm glad I came up when I did because I think the urge would have been to self-publish, and not that self-publishing is the worst thing in the world. I just think that's a hard, almost impossible road to hoe. But for me, it's like whenever I wrote something, it's like, no, someone's got to pay me for this. I'm not giving this away, for free. It was just too hard. Like, so I just gave myself permission to be patient, and I had a day job that gave me shitty health insurance. So it was a little bit easier, hey, if this story doesn't work out, I'll just write the next one. Like,
Yeah.
I'm not going to try to satisfy some imaginary, thing that the mainstream is going to like. I'm going to write stories that I want to read, and just believe, hopefully, that there'll be enough weirdos out there like me that would want to read it at some point.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah. So I mean, that's the long or short version of it. But so it was just dumb patience, just trying to give myself. Yeah, in terms of math, I thought of it in terms of opportunities. The more opportunities, the more tries I gave myself, the greater chance I had of having a little bit of luck and something hitting.
Yeah. And you were always being authentically passionate, right? Like it seems like even Mike Flanagan, he believes in um the work he does. But again, we see people at their success peak. Like we
Yeah.
see Paul Tremblay in bookstores, right? Like we see the collection of your books, but we
Yeah.
don't see the journey. Like it's not an overnight, like it didn't just happen.
Oh, definitely not.
It's a
Yeah.
pathway that people create. And it does seem like what connects those who are able to break through is you have put in the work to be passionate and, you know, make those um like make art that doesn't reach the masses. Like
Yeah.
you make art that sometimes just exists for your own and like your own creative interests, and then it
Sure.
leads you to that project that speaks to the mainstream.
Yeah, and I think, one of the nice things about sort of horror fans and horror writers and readers is, for the most part, every community is going to have like their bad actors. Um, but, I've found the horror community to be really supportive
Yeah.
and welcoming to new voices, wanting to see people do well because we like horror. Like,
Yeah.
in some ways, it's like when we greet each other, we get so excited because in our day-to-day life, we're not running into many horror fans. So when we do meet someone who like has that same interest, we clutch to them.
So you all have heard me talk about my friend Christian Garcia's excellent podcast called That Old Gay Classic Cinema. Well, just in time for spooky season, everything fall and gothic, he just had on friend of the show, Joseph Federico, to talk about Dracula. Yes, Dracula starring Bela Lugosi. So you can now listen to that episode wherever you get your podcast, like Spotify or Apple. And you might have seen I've been releasing some That Old Gay Classic Cinema episodes on the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. You can now listen to his premiere episode that I got to talk about The Sound of Music with him, which I really loves that I was on the inaugural episode. Thank you, Christian. Also, we released his Gone with the Wind episode, and we only released part one. So to listen to part two, you have to head over to his podcast. So if you love all things classic cinema and you've wondered, wait, what makes some classic cinema just really queer? Like, it actually sometimes is more homoerotic than current contemporary films. You want to listen to Christian's podcast. And he also has a special Wizard of Oz episode that I absolutely fan over. So listen to That Old Gay Classic Cinema, Apple, Spotify, and he's on YouTube as well. I hope you all enjoy it. Yeah. And I
And
do
we're
feel like
excited for it. Yeah.
horror like enthusiasts, in my opinion, tend to be the most psychologically balanced people because they found ways to like let loose their anger and frustration and stress with outlets that are um like they can put their desires into healthy outlets where fictive people are the ones who are doing all the illegal
Yeah.
activities. You should see the
Yeah.
reality TV community, Paul.
Yeah.
They got some interesting
I bet.
skeletons in their closet. But so I do have to like as we're nearing the end, I'm just so curious, like to get a review. I mean, not to like say Stephen King is, the guru of all things horror literature, but I do think he is
Oh
um,
yeah.
just like Joyce Carol Oates, like
Mhm.
very prolific and like for him to read your work and say about horror movie. I think doesn't he what does he say again that it was um like terrific but also extremely troubling or something
Yeah.
in that regard.
No,
Like
yeah.
do you have many conversations with Stephen King?
Yeah, so he first like tweeted about my book, A Head Full of Ghosts,
Mhm.
which really frankly like gave that book just like a push that it needed and helped turn it into like this weird like cult hit novel. Yeah, so immensely grateful to Stephen for all the support. He's been, super supportive of my work. And yeah, he and I email, fairly regularly. Super nice guy, very down to earth. Uh, you know, I'm sure he has an ego, but it comes off as egoless as well. So no, like I beyond like I fell in love with reading because of Stephen and actually Anne Joyce Carol Oates that you mentioned. I fell in love with reading, never mind writing because of those two. So no, I can't put a measure or value on how much, his work and his support has meant and continues to mean.
Mm. Yeah. Well, and something that I think why like I even fell in love with horror, it was through Stephen King and Carrie. That was my first horror novel in middle
Yeah,
school. Um, is like horror and fairy tales to me like follow a close path. Like, right, I mean, a witch who's burning children alive and turning them into gingerbread cookies
yeah,
is incredibly evil. But
yeah,
like fairy tales usually have the happy ending. It's like horror is just without a happy ending. And
right.
like I think Stephen King said Carrie was like an upside down Cinderella. Like if it
Oh, that
just
makes sense. Yeah.
went into the horror malevolent realm. But
Right.
you know, what for you just, Paul keeps you going in terms of like finding ideas? Like even right now, is there anything you're turning to for, okay, this is probably going to be my next creative idea?
Mm. Um, I wish I was a writer that had like this backlog of stories, like, oh, I know I'm going to write this, and I usually, especially novels, I usually go from novel to novel, and I have to find it like and start all over again. Which in some ways is kind of fun because I feel like that keeps it fresh for me, but it's also terrifying because like, hey, what if, what if I don't have an idea? Um, but I also like I know I don't think I'll run out of, who knows, maybe I would run out of ideas, but typically so many come from what we were talking about earlier. There's the spark and passion of listening to music that I love or watching movies or reading books.
Hmm.
Just even reading something like Mariana Enriquez's Our Share of Night. I could never in a million years write that novel. It's so damn perfect and genius,
Mm.
but it just excites me. It makes me want to try something. I mean, that's the part like I hope never leaves, for as long as I, keep writing is it comes from a place of, it comes from a place of being a fan and admirer of other people's art. Um, and that helps me fuel my own. It's like, oh, I want to try to do something cool. Maybe not exactly like that, but something that makes someone else feel like this is making me feel. Um, so yeah, unabashed. I look to other places for inspiration for sure.
Yeah. Well, I have to even let you know, my parents have been consuming the audiobook, which I have to say, everyone out there, like if you
Yeah.
don't even think you're an audiobook lover, like horror movies, an incredible audiobook with this, I think it's a nine cast
Yeah.
performing the book, but someone I've had on the podcast, Michael Crouch, is one of the actors, and
Oh,
I
nice.
always love Michael's
Yeah.
interpretation when he does like these psychological thriller type characters. But yeah, you're just the audiobook is incredible. It's just you've
I
really
was very lucky.
created, yeah, yeah, it's such a good cast. But like you've created such a well done um like not only novel, but something that has such an appeal to a performance. So I have to ask, of course, Paul,
Yeah.
um, is there like a film in the works for a horror movie?
So, I mean, so I can't say with who or
Hmm.
what, but just geez, at the beginning of October, agreed to an option. So again, an option is like they essentially rent like a year and a half to try to get it going. But I couldn't be more excited about who's involved
Oh, good.
and what production company is involved. It's really exciting to the point where like it's really hard for me to keep this news to myself. Hopefully they make some sort of an announcement at some point in it's still far away. Like we don't have
Mhm.
anything. Like we just sort of agreed to do it. So yeah, fingers crossed. But I think if it ends up being made by who we've agreed with, I don't think they would sand off like the rough edges and
Mhm.
keep it disturbing and hopefully keep to the heart of what the story is about.
Oh, good, good. Well, I'm excited for that, Paul. And
Thanks.
just my final thing is, if you will entertain me, I
Yeah.
just want to read iconic horror films from the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And I'm just curious, what is your favorite horror film from each of these categories?
All
I feel
right.
like it'll give us a lot of insight into even more into your mind. Um, so from the 1970s, out of Halloween, Carrie, The Exorcist, or The Omen, what is your favorite horror film?
I did, it's funny, I forgot which films. I did sneak a peek at these lists, and I thought the other two decades were easy for me. Uh, Geez, it might have to be The Exorcist. Although Carrie is probably pretty close. I will say though, like I rewatched Carrie recently, it's great, but it is hilarious how old the actors are. They're playing teenagers. Like you can see some of them with like crow's feet. Uh, it cracks me up. But it's hard not to say The Exorcist, especially since, the novel that sort of made me A Head Full of Ghosts is definitely sort of in conversation with that.
Mm, mm. Yeah. Okay, so the 80s, A Nightmare on Elm Street, Poltergeist, Friday the 13th, or The Thing.
It's easy for me because the thing is either the top or second favorite movie of mine all time. So yeah, The
Mm.
Thing for sure.
Okay. And then the 90s, The Blair Witch Project, Scream, The Craft, or The Haunting.
Uh, Blair Witch Project, hands down. The Haunting is awful. Sorry, Jan de Bont, if you're listening. No, Blair Witch Project. I use that movie as like a litmus test if I'm talking to somebody. If they don't like that movie, I kind of just discount the rest of their artistic opinions.
I
That's
love
so
that.
obnoxious, but I can't help it. No, I love that movie. It's wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, how can everyone, Paul, out there? I mean, you have so many fans, but I want to make sure you get even more horror fans, or not even those who listen to the podcast who didn't think they were horror fans. And,
Yeah.
I do think, your novel is extremely like extremely suspenseful, psychologically suspenseful, but it isn't like where you can't sleep at night. Like I do think
Yeah.
that it's nice because it accesses a community where if they don't think they're horror fans, you can like nicely manipulate them, which is
Yeah.
good. Like
Thanks.
unlike Terrifier,
Right.
where
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think if
No.
you just don't like gore, you're never even going to turn on that TV.
No.
Um,
Yeah.
so how can everyone follow you, Paul? And where can they just get their hands on all things Tremblay
Sure.
universe?
So I'm probably most active on Instagram these days. So it's at Paul G Tremblay. It's my handle. Still barely hanging on to X or Twitter, I guess, with the same handle. I'm on Blue Sky. I guess just Paul Tremblay. But if you go to my website, which is paultremblay.net, I also have like a free sign up for a newsletter. Yeah, I usually only send that out like once a month, so I'm definitely not spamming your inbox. But yeah, partially with updates, and I usually write some sort of little essay about whatever happens to be going on.
Okay.
Yeah,
Well, thank you, Paul. This has been wonderful. And thanks for, being here in time for Halloween. And I can't wait to see what happens with horror movie. I'm, you know, gonna
yeah,
make sure I keep up to date with all things going on in your universe.
yeah.
And I
Well,
can't
thank
wait
you,
for your
Andrew.
next novel, Paul.
Thank you, Andrew. I appreciate it. This was a lot of fun.
Oh, thank you. Okay, well, have a great day, Paul. And, bye to everyone out there. While I'm no longer a Long Island resident, yes, I have graduated to North Jersey. I've moved in with my boyfriend, and, I'm just very grateful. So, when I like to reminisce and recall the beautiful fall nostalgic memories I have about Port Jefferson Village, located in the middle of Long Island, right on the Long Island Sound, you can see Connecticut on a clear day. I think about the Soapbox NY, a beautiful bath and body boutique. My friend Janine Cucci is a co-owner there. Her mother, Mariana, is at the helm of the ship. And I know that they have such wonderful fall products from apple cider shea butter soap to pumpkin spice sugar scrub, Orchard Breeze hand and body lotion, and yes, Farmhouse Fresh, a paraben free and very, very environmentally friendly and animal friendly company. They do not test any of their products on animals. Splendid Dirt is a wonderful pumpkin mud mask that I still use even when it's not the fall because who doesn't want to smell pumpkin in the summer? I do. So head on over to Instagram, TikTok at the Soapbox NY. If you message Janine on Instagram, she will get back to you within the day. If you want just like an assortment of some of her favorite fall products, she'll put that together for you. And if you need a beautiful town to visit in the Northeast, head on over to Port Jefferson because it is such a beautiful town, especially in the fall and the winter season. Okay, I hope you all enjoy your Soapbox NY products as much as I do.